Lizzie Fortune was riding like the wind today. Every wave seemed to fold just right, and every turn went smooth as butter. The 18-year-old just hoped that this was a foreshadowing of the competition that would be taking place in 2 days. She needed this to go well. If Lizzie managed to place on the podium, she was sure to attract the attention of the dozens of recruiters that were going to be there. And that's exactly why she chose this far-off spot to fit in a last-minute practice session. Lizzie needed the element of surprise if she was going to stand out, and she couldn't risk any of her competition, the spectators or the recruiters, to see her in action. So that morning, Lizzie loaded her van with her surfboard, packed a lunch, and drove an hour south of Perth. Well, away from prying eyes. And the day was going fantastic. The weather couldn't have been better. The water temperature was fine, and every wave was perfect. Lizzie had spent the whole morning in the surf, eaten her lunch when the heat of the day was at its peak, and headed straight back for most of the afternoon. Soon the temperature would drop, and she would be headed home, where her mother had a high-protein dinner waiting for her. Deborah Fortune was just as invested as Lizzie in making this competition successful. Deb held down 2 jobs and a household alone to give her 2 girls, Lizzie and Zoe, every spare moment they had on the water. The sisters were promising up-and-comers in the sport. Zoe, at 12, was already streaking through every junior event she could get her hands on, just like her sister did before her. And in 2 days, Deb and Zoe would be on the sidelines to cheer Lizzie on. Lizzie took a moment between waves to catch her breath before heading out one last time. She reveled in the sun and the thought of her mother and the sacrifices she had made to get her girls to where they were. Lizzie felt very content where she sat and smiled. In her moment of daydreaming, Lizzie was blissfully unaware of the dangers lurking beneath her. But she hadn't been alone in the water for some time. A 17-foot-long predator had been circling her for the past hour, patiently observing the target that was floating above it. Twice it had allowed its fin to break the surface. But Lizzie, focused on paddling or in the middle of riding a wave, had not taken notice of the stalking great white. The carnivore took this moment when its target was finally still to strike. Rearing from below, it sliced its massive frame almost elegantly through the current, opening its jaws wide. Suddenly, Lizzie and her board were pulled in by the rushing water as the colossal beast emerged. If it had not been for the force of the current pulling her in, it might have just bitten through the tail end of her board. But the momentum drove her close enough for its teeth to rip through her back. Lizzie felt her skin and muscles shred with the force of its clamp, and she tumbled into the water, right into the shark's playground. The animal had tasted blood and the hunt had just begun. It turned swiftly back toward its prey, gunning for a second attack. Lizzie had no time to compose. Her head was under, and she had no sense of up or down. She knew the thing had gotten her, but she felt no pain. Only the heat from the blood that was escaping from her wounds. Her leg was still attached to its strap, and that was what gave her direction. She now knew which way was up, but her head never reached the surface. The monster was already on her again. Now it had the advantage of sighting her inside the water. This time its strike was true and final. Lizzie Fortune was nearly severed in half as it clamped down around her middle, and her death was swift and painless. Her world went dark before she realized the full scope of the situation, and that she was about to leave this world forever. It would be hours before any alarm was raised. Deborah knew something was wrong when night fell. She called authorities, and within the hour, search parties had set out to find the missing girl. But Deborah and Zoe found Lizzie's van parked on the beach, with her empty lunch bag still on the hood in the early hours of the morning. Before the sun rose to mark the day, what was left of Lizzie's surfboard was found, the ankle strap still attached to its owner's foot. That would be all that was ever found of the promising surfer, and it was all her mother and sister had to bury. The competition went on, and the crowd and competitors took a moment of silence to mourn the loss of the rising star. The remaining Fortune women thought it was a sweet gesture, but there would never ever be true closure from their grievous loss. Though Toby Farling had come to Egypt to see the pyramids, he and his fiancée had toured as much of the country as they could for the last 2 weeks. Toby and Alicia were amazed to discover that Egypt had so much to offer, and more sights beyond Giza to see than they could possibly fit into a 2-week vacation. They had 4 more days of their trip left before they were booked to fly back to London. And today was going to be spent in the resort town of Hurghada, nestled along the Red Sea coast. The last thing that came to the British nationals' minds when thinking of Egypt was going to the beach. They had expected only to see endless desert and megalithic structures. They certainly were not expecting luxurious resorts that served outstanding food and boasted bright swimming pools, spas, and beaches full of tourists and jet skis. Alicia was currently getting a massage in one of these spas, and Toby knew that she would be enjoying herself thoroughly for the next few hours, so he decided to head to the beach beyond the resort. His pale English skin was not made to stay in the sun this long or so directly, so Toby opted to enter the water in his swimming trunks, a t-shirt and copious amounts of sunscreen to cover any exposed skin. The shore was busy. Children played in the shallows and grown-ups basked in the sun. The water was lovely, and before long, Toby was fully submerged and swimming just beyond the line where the waves broke. The 34-year-old was an excellent swimmer and had competed well through his college years. Toby was no stranger to dangerous waters since his work took him all over the world, and he never missed a chance to jump into whatever natural waterways the country he was in had to offer. Today, Toby was the only one to venture that far in. The other beachgoers were content to stay in the shallows or on the sand. By all accounts, he was alone in the water with only a tiger shark for company, though he was not aware of that fact just yet. The aquatic hunter had smelled the warm bodies since that morning, and finally one of them had ventured far enough into the water for it to hone in on. Toby had swum right into the sights of the hungry animal and had no idea of the danger he was in. It glided through the water, keeping its eyes fixated on the long, white silhouette swimming on the surface. It took its time. There were no other moving bodies on the water, but this one was going to make sure that when it finally struck, it would clamp down once, and only once. The scent of blood and heat and life was raging through its senses. The beast was certain that now was the time to strike. 12 feet of pure speed and hunger propelled the shark upward. It rocketed through the current. The brute force and astounding speed had the fish, and its prey launched straight into the air as it clamped down on Toby's middle. From the shore, the crowd would see the sudden eviction of a gray sea beast with the flailing man in its jaws. It launched clean out of the water, making an almost graceful arc in the air, and dived back, taking Toby with it. The horrified onlookers who had caught the movement screamed. Those that had not caught sight of the initial attack turned to look at the source of the panic. They could see the water turn deep red even from their vantage point on the sand. The entire beach was in an uproar, and several men bravely mounted their jet skis to race to the site. Even though the man had not surfaced, they hoped to at least scare the beast away with their engines. Maybe there was still a chance, but the jet skis weren't even halfway toward Toby before they stopped dead in the water. Right in front of them, the spotted form of the shark appeared out of the water with another magnificent leap. But only the man's lower half was in its jaws this time. Toby's gray swimming shorts were soaked entirely crimson. The would-be rescuers turned their vessels around and fled back. There was no saving the man now. He had perished soon after the first bite. Parents were rushing their children back to the resort to spare them the horrific sight that was taking place in the water. The animal was continuing its feeding frenzy. Every few seconds it would appear with another limb, and the water would splash up pink and red. The beach cleared most of the people quickly enough. Only a handful had stayed, transfixed in horror at the violent activity in the waters in front of them. Alicia and the rest of the patrons in the resort wondered about the sudden commotion and ruckus coming from outside. But she was not aware of the gravity of the situation until authorities came searching for her. There was nothing to salvage for her fiancé to bring back home. The shark had devoured every part of Toby. Alicia and Toby's family and friends could only grieve from afar, with no solace to be found at a grave. Plettenberg Bay was in its peak holiday season. December in South Africa is hot and busy. The little town, usually quiet and uneventful, came alive during Christmas. Students celebrated end-of-year exams, families took annual camping trips, and surfers rode waves. On every street corner, pop-up street food vendors were barely keeping up with orders for traditional bunny chow dishes and fish and chips wrapped in brown paper. Brandon Jacobs, his wife, and 3 children were among the many families enjoying some time off. But today, Brandon was going snorkeling. Dinah had taken the kids to a trampoline park so he could have some free time to explore every nook and crevice he could fit into a single day. Though he had spent quite some time driving around to find a quiet spot, the beach was packed with people as far as the eye could see. Brandon would just have to accept that his time in the water would have to be shared with others. But he was lucky enough to find an outcrop of rock that was mostly taken up by snorkelers like himself, and the morning soon turned into an enjoyable experience, away from rowdy teenagers and in good company with other middle-aged swimmers. They spent the first few hours with their heads underwater, even collecting a few mussels along the rock line. Brandon and his new acquaintances cooked them up right there on the beach. After their delicious lunch, a moment to rest, and an extra lather of sunscreen, Brandon and the 14 other divers headed back to the water, just as the waves were pulling into low tide. Leaving even more rock exposed, the shallow outcrop had been thoroughly explored by now, and Brandon was soon heading farther into the surf. Though the water was much deeper here, plenty of boulders rose out to the surface. Brandon could come up, sit on one to catch his breath, and head back down again, moving from one rough boulder to the next, further and further away from the shore. Soon he had no other companions in his vicinity except for the occasional canoe that rowed past. Brandon did not mind. The conversation had been nice, but he did come for some quiet time after all. From out in the sea, a hunter had been gliding closer and closer to the waves, seeking out a lone target that had strayed away from the melee of movement in the shallows. Over 1,000 pounds and 4 meters gracefully prowled the waters, patiently waiting for someone to move out from the herd. The beast had no trouble spotting the lone diver. As the female great white made her way toward Brandon, her back fin broke the surface briefly. A canoeing couple saw it cut through the water for a few seconds before going back down. They shouted their alarm immediately, urging everyone within earshot to get out of the water. The reaction from the other swimmers was immediate, and they scrambled over each other to get out to the sand. Canoes were desperately rowing to the dock, and the snorkelers climbed onto the closest outcrops they could reach. Even Brandon, who was farthest out, heard the commotion and turned his head toward the hollering couple in the canoe. He realized almost instantly what they were warning him about. Without missing a beat, he turned to the shoreline and started pumping his arms as hard as he could cross the distance to safety. But it was too late, and Brandon was too far out. The shark had already locked him into her sight, and she was closing in fast. She could see the figure above her moving fast from the depths, but he was not faster than she was. With all of its monstrous strength and speed, the great white cut through the water. Her massive jaws closed around both of Brandon's legs. The boaters briefly saw the huge gray body as it pulled the man under, leaving only red bubbles and foam in its wake. Brandon did not have a chance to react or yell out. The powerful wrench from beneath had so much force that Brandon's hips dislocated from their sockets. He felt the pop in his abdomen as the bones dislodged from the joint. The salty water swallowed Brandon's scream of terror. The animal's teeth sliced at Brandon as she dragged him down. Suddenly the pull snapped and he was no longer attached to her jaws. Brandon felt a moment of relief. She had let him go. He attempted to kick his legs to get to the surface, but to his horror he realized there was nothing to kick out with. The shark had not let him go. In fact, she had severed both of his legs. The water around him was tainted with his life's blood pouring out into the ocean. Even as the full comprehension of the sure fatality seconds away sank in, Brandon's vision slipped into black. The severing of both of the femoral arteries meant that he bled out in less than 10 seconds. Brandon Jacobs was dead before his head bobbed above the surface. The animal, with a mouth full of an efficient amount of flesh to fill her stomach, for now headed back off into the deep. It would be the very boaters that tried to warn Brandon of the incoming danger that fished his remains out. They could not drag his upper body onto the canoe without capsizing their vessel, so the man held on to what was left of Brandon's shirt and dragged it along as his female partner rowed them to the beach. They had the body out on the sand before rescue services even arrived. The professionals cleared the beaches, removed the remains, and set out to find the deceased man's people. But besides his first name, Brandon had no identification, and no one at the scene knew anything about him besides that single detail. It wouldn't until that evening when Dinah Jacobs, frantic with worry, arrived at the police station to report her husband missing, that Brandon was finally identified. The great white would go on to attack twice more in that same month before it was caught, captured too late to spare 3 families the grief and loss of their loved ones.